Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel on infrastructure at Rome Med 2021. Some people probably think that infrastructure is something of a luxury topic. Often it's food security, human development, and other issues that are commonly accepted as being very critical for people to simply survive. But without good infrastructure, obviously, people can't properly make it to their jobs. Oil can't be transported, food can't make it to markets, tourists won't come to countries, and it's very difficult for countries to get onto that supply chain highway. So we've got a big topic to parse right now when we talk about the MENA region and infrastructure, because it's a very unequal region in many ways in terms of income and development. Some countries are struggling just with security. Everyone is struggling with recovery from the pandemic, but there isn't the connecting infrastructure that the EU has. So it's a bit more piecemeal, but such an important region. And of course, also everyone on top of bouncing back from this pandemic and trying to get their countries better connected and update their infrastructure, need to make sure that what they do from here on in is environmentally friendly. So again, the topic is exhaustive because infrastructure can be anything from internet to roads, but there are some common themes that we're going to get into, and that is investment, private versus public, development, financial institutions, and how can these different elements work better together. And underlying this, of course, I like to think about infrastructure as an instrument for peace in the greater region. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce this terrific panel who has gathered on a Friday evening ahead of a long weekend, a very long weekend for some of these participants. First of all, we've got with us Ricardo Duto, the head of industry, infrastructure, and real estate partners at Intesa Sanpaolo. Welcome. Sergio Pimenta, the regional vice president for Africa of the IFC. We have Stefano Napolitano, senior partner of McKinsey & Company. Luca Lazzaroli, director general, deputy head of operations for the EIB. And finally, Claudio Viezzoli, managing director of the EBRD. So again, welcome to all of you. And I think I will get right to the questions. And the first one will be for Ricardo. Intesa Sanpaolo is very involved in and committed to supporting Italy's development, but also plays a historic and increasingly vital role in investment, in economic growth in the Mediterranean countries. What is your view, Ricardo, of the energy transition priorities that we have before us now, and how that will impact relationships between countries and institutions in the Mediterranean and MENA region?
First of all, thank you for my engagement in this panel today. Yes, you're right. We are normally quite supportive of a good project across the Mediterranean region, and following the infrastructure industry, I'm normally engaged in the assessment of many of them. Your question about the impact of European priorities in the energy transition and the relationship with southern Mediterranean country goes, in my view, straight to the point, and it's a huge issue. Today's economic relationship, are based on a cross-dependency. The northern country needs basically fossil fuel, and the south needs investment and technology. But what happens if we decarbonize and we go 100% green with electrification and hydrogen through massive investments in renewable to become independent? Is it feasible? And what happens is that relationship needs to find new themes of discussion. So the future is not scary, but we need to understand what does independence really mean. And energy independence always come, in my view, with a cost. But you need to remember that if you are not efficient, you will never be independent in an open market economy. And I think we have a huge opportunity in terms of energy policy and also foreign policy. On the energy policy side, if we, as Europe, want to decarbonize our economy by 2050 through electrification and hydrogen, we need massive investments in competitive renewables. And the math is quite simple. We can easily convert into exawatt-hour of equivalent on annual consumption of fossil fuel, and then we convert those exawatt in square meter of land that is necessary, for example, to deploy solar panels, reach a figure that is close to a square that is hundreds of kilometers long and hundreds of kilometers wide, where you can quickly find that space and efficiently deploy that amount of stuff. In Europe, it's quite difficult. It's impossible to find a similar viability on land. And if you split that in many pieces, the effort will translate in cost to interconnect the production site with the grid. You need to consider that yields in North Africa for solar panels and wind are higher than in core Europe, and you can combine solar that works well during the day and the wind that in many locations works well during the night with thermal winds. And here comes the foreign policy opportunity, in my humble opinion. This is an opportunity to decarbonize North African economies, leapfrogging the existing technologies and bringing jobs. They are reducing also migration flow, at least those that are driven by economic reason, because the new technology are more labor intensive than the normal high carbon technology, and by far more accessible by common people. So that's my personal view on how the new dialogue towards the energy transition should unfold in the future.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to Sergio now. The World Bank Group and the IFC in particular have a key role to boost private investments in the MENA region. So I'm wondering what amount of funds are currently earmarked for that, specifically for connectivity infrastructure, and which are the countries you're most focused in, and what are the prospects for the years to come?
Thank you very much, Amy. It's a great pleasure and honor to be on this panel today. So thank you very much for having me. Let me try and address your question about what is the World Bank Group, and particularly what the IFC is doing in infrastructure in the Middle East and North Africa region. And I can tell you, in terms of, you were asking about sort of allocate, we don't allocate envelopes, but we have in the past been investing on the IFC side between $500 million to $1 billion a year in infrastructure in the emerging market countries of the Middle East and of the MENA region. As you know, we only focus on the emerging markets. That doesn't seem like a very large amount given the size of the needs, but at the same time, you have to see that this is probably about 50% of all the private the investment in private sector driven projects in infrastructure in those countries. And this is one of the key points, I would say, in terms of when we look at the infrastructure landscape in the region, is that it is a region where private sector is not playing as a big role as it could and as it should. And when compared with other regions, you can see that this is the region where private sector is playing actually a smaller role compared to any other region in the world. And this is very much due to the fact that these are economies where the public sector is playing a major role, and there's very little room for private sector to really invest in infrastructure. And this is one of the areas where you're asking me about sort of looking forward, where we think what we can do. The World Bank Group has been really focusing on encouraging governments to open up space for private sector to do more investments in infrastructure, among other sectors. And this is really an area of opportunity that we see with, as you were mentioning about rebounding from the current pandemic, economies have to continue doing large investments in many sectors, including infrastructure, and governments don't have the fiscal capacity to do all of what is needed. So it is important to bring in more private sector. And IFC, as the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, is really playing a role there. We're engaging with each of the governments, and we're engaging with private sector in these countries to make sure that we can continue investing and develop the sectors and have a bigger participation of private sector. And finally, you were asking particularly on the digital infrastructure. If there's one lesson that we all took from this pandemic is the importance of the digital economy and the importance of having a region that is better connected and where access to internet is stronger. And this is something where we have on our side invested quite a bit, including during the pandemic. For instance, we supported an African company called Liquid, who's setting fiber cables across the continent, and they are connecting with Egypt and installing fiber there, for instance. But there are more projects that we're doing in that space, and this is an area that is indeed very important.
Thank you. Stefano, we're going to turn to Stefano Napolitano, the senior partner at McKinsey. And in the aftermath of the pandemic, it's pretty clear that infrastructure investments are very important for this economic rebound everyone's waiting for and for the green transition. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what the infrastructure gap is. If you could qualify it, that would be great. And if you could talk about which areas, which sectors of infrastructure are most in need in the MENA region.
So let's start from the first question. Definitely not easy to give a close answer to the first question. How much is the infrastructure gap? Globally speaking, before the pandemic, we were used to considering 2-3 trillions per year the global infrastructure gap worldwide, the need of infrastructure, the need of money to cover the need of infrastructure. Actually, the pandemic, the COVID, has accelerated the infrastructure need in a certain sense. Let's think only to the energy transition. The energy transition has accelerated a lot. Actually, also the need of modernization of infrastructure. So not only new infrastructure, but also maintenance or upgrading of all the infrastructure. All these elements have been accelerated. And then as a consequence, if we want to assess the infrastructure gap as of today, is definitely much bigger globally than what we thought a couple of years ago. If we focus on the Mediterranean region, clearly, as also the colleague said before, this is a region where attracting private money is very complicated. Definitely is not the best practice in attracting private money to finance infrastructure. There is still a big gap of private money needed to sustain the financing of this big amount of money. Clearly, we are talking about something in the range of 200-300 billions of euro if we want to cover not only new infrastructure, and definitely transportation and connectivity are the main asset classes, but if we want also to consider retrofitting of building, maintenance of road system, maintenance of electricity grid, maintenance of gas and water pipes, all this kind of stuff, they really sum up in a big amount of billions. What I believe is important to consider more than the big number behind the infrastructure gap is the capacity, the ability of all these countries to deliver, to deploy this amount of money. On top, to make the money available, the biggest problem as we speak is really the ability to deploy at speed this big amount of money. And this is the main challenge we see around among countries, and we see around also in companies. Private and public companies in charge of infrastructure today struggle more in deploying money than in funding money.
Very interesting. Thank you. Luca, the EIB is strongly committed to the infrastructure development in the EU neighborhood, particularly the MENA region. What are the bank's investment priorities in connectivity specifically? And what ways could infrastructure connectivity investments improve long-term GDP development in this region?
So thank you, Ami, and thank you for this kind invitation to this panel. You mentioned earlier how the infrastructure can play an important role in long-term and sustainable growth. And obviously, we at the ISPI, we fully recognize ourselves into that sentence. In fact, when you look at the history of this institution, one of the main reasons is precisely that of rebuilding Italy, notably the southern part of Italy, the aftermath of the Second World War. Now, to your question, relevance of investments in infrastructure. Let me start maybe from the EU itself, because the Mediterranean has two sides, and so 40% of what the bank does these days goes to infrastructure projects. If you were to look at what the bank has been supporting in countries such as Spain or Greece or Italy, and notably when it comes to energy or transport infrastructure, you would see that that is about 20 billion worth euros of investments every year. If you then when we look at the MENA region, which is maybe the most interesting part, over the last years, the bank is supporting MENA region with, say, 2.5–3 billion of operations lending on a yearly basis. And the infrastructure project is about 1/3 of it. What is it that the bank factually, and I'm taking a very factual perspective to all this, has been supporting? Well, you would see that the bank has been supporting transport, energy, digitalization more recently, water, sanitation. So this is really the bread and butter of what the bank does. And that is to say, we fully recognize ourselves into what were regarded this morning as the three key challenges of the region. In other words, the digital transition, the green transformation, and the social challenge, which come with the previous two. Obviously, with the extra difficulty of making sure that these challenges move ahead simultaneously. In other words, with what that requires in terms of proper planning and proper economic incentives, notably for the private sector to be crowded in. I think if we take a step backwards and we look at the infrastructure, nobody can question the power of infrastructure works as enabler for growth. You will find multiple of studies specifically telling us that for every euro of infrastructure, there's a number of euros in GDP which will be induced or foregone if it's not done. But what's really striking, and two words, is just to say how striking is it's a contradictory apparently is the situation in the MENA region, which is that of a region with a huge potential. And when you look at the geographical situation of these countries, the proximity with the EU, the proximity with the networks of the EU, the capacity to integrate the value chain of European enterprises, the political interest that the EU is placing on developing a relationship with these countries. And you see that in multiple ways. There's this initiative about trans-Mediterranean corridors in the transport sector, or multiple proposals which go in the sense of bringing more integration between the energy networks between the Maghreb countries and the EU. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of potential going there. And you have obviously the fact that 25% of maritime traffic comes through the Mediterranean Sea. And you have this young population, plus 40% in 15–20 years, which does require more infrastructure. So it's almost a need. The estimates of the increasing demand for energy or for transport leave no doubt to the importance of supporting infrastructure. And at the same time, obviously with no intention to generalize, you see that over the last 20 years, the average of infrastructure investments in the region has been relatively low, even if you compare them to other emerging regions. And you also see that when you look at the level of integration of the infrastructure between different countries, it's relatively poor. Even where, for instance, you do find electricity interconnection, they're not used a lot. You know, traffic, international traffic, electricity could be higher, even on the basis of existing infrastructure. And you also see, for instance, when it comes to maritime connections, the bilateral direct connections, they're not that many. A lot of the traffic going from one country to the other actually goes through European ports. So there's a huge potential going forward. And maybe a last point on energy, which is obviously one of the key challenges for this region, considering the relevance of oil and gas reserves in some of these countries. We all understand the difficulty in embracing climate when you already have a well-developed industry of geared on conventional fossil fuels. But we also see what happens when countries do so. We have these very good experiences of countries such as Jordan, for instance, or Morocco, which have fully embraced renewable energy and who are set to become net exporter of energy in the years to come. And equally, we have the very good experiences, I would say, of most of the countries in the region in the sense of developing a regulatory framework which has proven to be capable of bringing in the private sector, notably in renewable energy through PPPs and other formulas. So steps are being taken, but it's still a lot of potential, I would say, untapped going forward. Thank you.
I would say that's a pretty positive take on things. That's looking at the glass half full more than half empty. So thank you very much, Luca. And now Claudio, the EBRD has traditionally been very involved in boosting growth and developing open and sustainable market economies in the region. In the 8 years of work you've done in North Africa, the bank's invested over $11.9 billion, or euros, excuse me, in nearly 300 projects. I'm wondering which investments you think are the most critical, urgent to improve overall competitiveness and to foster new quality and sustainable infrastructure investments, and which can also help to pave the way for decarbonization.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a pity not to be in Rome. Apparently, it was a very nice day today, but anyhow, lucky you who are all enjoying the city. So let me just give you a little bit of context, because as you mentioned, EBRD started as, in a way, last comer into this region, because we started expanding southwards beyond our traditional work region of operations relatively recently. But now we cover a significant part of the Mediterranean region with our presence in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, soon Algeria, Lebanon. Obviously, we're also in Jordan, Greece, Turkey, and the whole of the Western Balkans. So it's a significant part of what we do. If I sort of quantify, about 40% of what we do every year is in this region, and of this 40%, about say 30 to 35% is in infrastructure. So approximately $1.5 billion of investment every year that the EBRD puts on its book, it's in infrastructure in the Mediterranean. So it's relevant, it's very significant, and I can tell you it is not very easy to focalize on priorities, but I have to tell sort of that obviously you need to choose your champions, and I'll give you probably a little example of what we do. But I want to make a few comments. First of all, I think as per our sister institutions, every project that we do tries to have all the components that are significant at this stage of sort of historical time. So we need to have projects which are going to be as green as possible. We have committed to be fully Paris aligned by end of 2022. So this is not an external feature of our project making, but it is really internalized in the way we select, we execute, and we monitor projects. So every single project needs to have this particular feature. Obviously, we're not unique. We are aligned with all the other international institutions, so we are happy to be part of the crowd. Second point, obviously, if you look at the Mediterranean, the picture is very easy. You have a very clear, we have very strong developed northern part, and you have a very strongly growing southern part, especially in terms of urbanizations. So the needs of keeping up with infrastructure development and growing economies and growing population in terms of enhancing trade routes is essential. So if I to say probably one of the areas which we consider particularly relevant is the enhancement of all the transport logistics across the Mediterranean. This is essential. If you want to grow, you need to import and export more, especially in the areas where urbanization is very strong. So, for instance, if you look at Egypt, which has just passed the threshold of 100 million population, which is expected to grow between 5 and 7% per year over the next 3 to 5 years, and which has a still ongoing strong urbanization processes around Cairo and Alexandria. That is essential, at least for the EBRD, to make sure that the transport logistics, road, railways, and maritime logistics are actually implemented according to a very strong master plan, as Egypt has done. It's, you know, Egypt has about already 15 commercial ports operating. They are already planning 5 additional ports to make sure that growth is sort of accompanied with proper logistic development. But it also has planned 8 dry ports, some of which already financed with the support also of the EBRD, including some of the critical ports around the Suez Canal. So I would say probably priority number 1 is enhancement of logistical centers, okay? And I can give you other few examples, but the point is that that is really what will make Morocco and Egypt in particular like the strong champions in terms of connection on at the regional level. The second strong priority, and I quote something that Stefano, I think, mentioned before, is about capacity. We all have the ability as international institutions to deploy resources to the grounds. We have our systems, we can assess projects very well. We have all the technical experts. What really misses in terms of priorities is the capacity from local administrations to actually implement timely the project, to deploy the money into real actions. And that's the reason why us, but with all our colleagues from the other institution, actually invest a lot in capacity building. So there's no point for us to work as we are doing with the Egyptian National Railways Company for new passenger trains, for locomotives, for freight movements, unless we actually improve the administrative capacity of the company. So that's a very, very important point. So, which is not on the hard investment, it's soft skills, but it is a co-essential element of the way we can accelerate growth. And the third element of priority, again, I quote, I think Sergio was mentioning this one on private sector. It is actually critical that we allow for more private sector to come through whatever schemes, including PPPs, because sovereign capacities is extremely limited given the needs. And therefore, any effort we can make to create the financial structures and products to be able to leverage on private sector ability is actually welcome in the region. And then again, we're not the only one, but we are investing a lot in PPP capacity building also in the countries where we operate. Let me finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudio. And that sort of brings me nicely back to Riccardo, because I'd like to ask how you think that public and private investment could be better coordinated and what can be done to court more foreign or more private investment in infrastructure projects in the MENA region.
Okay, let me focus on a sector where private investors are normally keen to invest, and the sector is obviously energy. And in the energy transition, you have many temporary market failure that might be addressed by with the help of development banks working side by side with the private sector. And then to crowd in the private sector, first you need to reduce uncertainties. And I fully agree that to develop PPPs and other project local capabilities and capability building is key. The first risk or alternatives that are not coordinated priorities set by different governments in the area towards energy transition. So more coordination is needed, and you need to coordinate in making choices, because when you share an infrastructure, in the end, you have to share the same targets and the same vision of the future. Then then you have the technological risk, and to explain you this, let me make some examples. For example, to choose and support the break-even on new green technology, for example, to build new electrolyzers or new green generation technology, you need some support to reach the break-even and to manage costs. Because technology innovation will drive a key role also in leapfrogging some technological choice by North Africa countries, and so to immediately switch from one system to another system, because they have by far lower legacy than northern Mediterranean countries. But the risk is there, because if you move fast or if you move alone, you can incur in the end in stranded cost, not in a competitive advantage. And if you wait your business risk is to be displaced by other technology all of a sudden. Then there is a third risk that is a little bit weird. That's the private investor post-COVID and post-COP26 are quite selective and committed to support sustainable development. But the definition of what is sustainable entails its own risk, because what was sustainable or considered sustainable 5 years ago may no longer be considered sustainable today. So where we are a private investor, I invest on a 20 years horizon, this becomes an issue. But I'm quite optimistic about this point, because it's addressed by the Blue Dot Network, an OECD initiative with the G7, and is strictly coordinated with the Build Back Better initiatives, and that is trying to deliver a public scheme for sustainability rating assessment that I guess will be used by development banks and private investors to measure additionality and their investment towards the energy transition.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of information to digest, and I'm curious, and maybe we'll be able to touch on it later, if what was sustainable 5 years ago is no longer considered sustainable, because I would imagine that's another very big theme of just trying to keep up with the developments in technology and population growth and facts on the ground, and even issues of civil unrest that can stop projects from moving forward. But I think now I'll turn to Sergio and ask you, Sergio, how you think more private investment could be drawn to the region. What needs to be done to get those wheels set more quickly in motion? Thank you,
and let me just try and address this question. I really want to echo some of the comments that were made by some of our fellow panelists in terms of indeed the need to bring in more private sector. And I know that many of our the organizations that are represented in this panel, I mean, we're all working towards that goal and trying to bring more private sector. I think a few things need to be looked at it, and I don't need to come back to why this is so important, but you have to realize that, you know, a lot of some commentators are referring to the last decade as a lost decade for MENA, right? Because the GDPs per capita have not really increased. I mean, they're either at the same level they were in 2010, or they have gone a little bit lower than that. So there is a real need to improve the economies, and infrastructure is so key that we all have to focus on that. I think there's a few things that could be that need to be done, and some of them were already mentioned. I agree on the point that was made around the capacity building, and most of our organizations are indeed deploying resources to help build that capacity in the governments to know how to manage private sector in an effective way, how to bring in high quality investors in the country, and we do that through different approaches. One of them being, for instance, working on private-public partnerships and helping create either the legal framework or regulatory framework that is needed for that, bring in best practice and show examples of what has succeeded in other countries, but also help capacity building in terms of the public sector people who are working on attracting private sector, on building and structuring this type of transactions. We have teams that help governments structure PPPs, and this has been quite successful. I mean, I've heard in the panel talk about earlier about what happened in Jordan, in Morocco. We've also had good examples in Egypt, where together with some of the partners like EBRD in this panel, we really unlocked the largest solar farm panel. I mean, solar power plant in the world. Actually is in the southern part of Egypt, and this is a very interesting private-public partnership that was pushed in that front. So I think focusing on that aspect, on the private-public partnerships, is going to be very key. I think we also have to look at the role of state-owned companies in the sector, and what they are doing, and also help them improve their governance, improve their efficiency. You know, a lot of them could have their capital being opened to private sector, so that you would bring that discipline. And this is one of the areas that we are encouraging governments to look into, privatization programs, or opening up capital of public entities to private sector, so that you can leverage private capacity in terms of funding, in terms of human resources, in terms of innovation and knowledge. These are the areas that could be really developed. And then the third point that was also mentioned by one of the panelists a little bit earlier, but I would really insist on, I think, is this issue of regional integration. MENA is the least integrated region in the world, and as was pointed out earlier, a lot of interactions go from the southern shores of the Mediterranean to the northern shores and then back, rather than having a lot of within the MENA region interaction. So efforts done around regional integration, whether it's on infrastructure projects or other dimensions, is something that I would really encourage. And then my last point is, I think the biggest opportunity that we have in today's world is really the greening of economies. And this is something where the private sector has developed a lot of knowledge and skills. And when you see the shift that some of the economies are doing towards renewable energy, towards greener buildings and greener construction, towards greener finance. I mean, we've supported the issuance of the first green bonds in the MENA region. This is something that I think will have a very important impact on the long term. So this is something that having a more inclusive society in terms of building on the capacity of the private sector to attract innovation around the climate change agenda, I think that is going to be key.
I'm wondering, as you speak, and I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if some of these hydrocarbon producers who are so strong in their markets are showing any potential to be as strong in the renewable energy sector. But
I think,
yeah.
if I may, I think there is a reflection that is being led by the governments of oil-producing countries in the region. And by all of them, I mean, almost if not all of them, on thinking about the post-oil economy and how you have also a world that is more that is improved in terms of climate change. And you can see the efforts, for instance, that Oman is doing in terms of bringing in a more diversified economy and more renewable energy, and other countries. I mean, Saudi is going through the same reflection, and you have this type of efforts being done. So I think we can help all countries manage this transition and really I mean, we all say, of course, that countries in the Gulf have a lot of resources in oil, but they also have a lot of sun, right? And it's a renewable energy that they can use and unleash very easily. So that's an area we should all support them.
Yeah, and it would be nice to think that some of those grand ideas and plans that are underway can be shared with some of the poorer, possibly more war-torn countries in the region that also could implement new energies based on sun and follow some of in the footsteps of some of these plans, but might need a little boost, an infusion of cash to do it. Stefano, I wanted to ask you what you think the main needs of companies in the region are to improve their connectivity infrastructure at this moment. What do you see as the sort of top priorities?
Well, actually, if for connectivity infrastructure, you mean digital infrastructure, definitely this is a key topic for many technological companies. And this is definitely one of the key points of the recovery fund or of all the subsidies, all the money that are coming from public sector to sustain infrastructure development. What I believe is important to point out is exactly what Sergio, by the way, just said. And also, let's say, the other colleagues that they pointed out, the ability to deploy money. This is also true for connectivity infrastructure, the same identical problem that you can find for roads, rail, pipe, and so on and so forth. Deployment of a big network of infrastructure, because we are still talking about grid, is the main challenge among deployment of money. Because when it comes to a large distributed grid, this is complex even more than just a simple infrastructure. You need a very robust supply chain, and this is the main challenge. Many of us already pointed out that the bottleneck we need to fix is the ability of the supply chain to deliver. You don't deliver infrastructure just throwing money into the system. You need capabilities, you need organizations, you need an army of people able to deploy this money. And this is what is missing, especially for whatever is a network of infrastructure. A system road, a grid of cables, a grid of electricity, and so on and so forth. What I want really to point out is the importance of state-owned companies, okay? Or semi-public or fully controlled by governments and companies. This company might have a very important role in the challenge, in the infrastructure challenge that we will see in the coming months. And if this company can open up their capital to private money, this definitely will help a lot to reinforce capabilities, to modernize governance, and definitely the combination of these two elements will help the ability to deploy. So I strongly believe that as never in the history, in the modern history, we have the possibility to take advantage from the big availability of money that the system is throwing, changing what otherwise would take many years to be done. Privatization of private companies, upgrading of capabilities, change in rules. We have two big two big rule systems that can be upgraded. One is the PPP framework across all countries. This is a framework almost used in many countries. In some countries is well developed, in other countries is still at its beginning. So definitely this is a framework that can be upgraded to attract private equity. And the second one, procurement public law. All the countries in the region, they have a public procurement law that's at the crossroad of a deployment infrastructure. Simplification, acceleration, digitization of all these processes, again, are a big bottlenecking of the capacity to deploy infrastructure.
Thank you. Luca, I'd like to get your take now on how you evaluate the state of connectivity between the two shores.
Thank you, Amy. Well, I'd say that despite my innate optimism and despite the multiple initiatives which are being discussed or have been in discussion for a bit of time between the EU and the MENA region, and I refer to sectoral initiatives. I mentioned earlier this trans-Mediterranean transport network, or different proposals to integrate the electricity. But despite all that, I think it's a fact that the level of infrastructure investments in the region and the level of integration, as we all seem to agree, is low. Actually, we ran a survey, and we've done the survey, I think with EBRD and the World Bank. This was a joint survey in the MENA region where we contacted the SMEs, some of them being very small. Then we asked them the question, so what is the main obstacle for you to develop business? And lack of access to transport was the second highest ranking deficiency. And I think 1 out of 4 said that transport is really the major obstacle. And that came after access to finance, by the way. 80% of them indicated that they have a limited access to finance. Just thought I would just mention that. Obviously, when you look at you take a map, you look at geography, one can clearly see that the ports in the region offer probably the greatest opportunity for connectivity. I mean, we mentioned earlier the amount of maritime traffic going through Mediterranean, the proximity, of course. And we do have some very positive experiences. Morocco, the Tangier-Med port infrastructure, Egypt, a number of very important initiatives. And we equally, when you look at the investment plans of all these countries, they're very, very ambitious. So that is in a way boding well. Now, challenges and difficulties, and I can only echo what other speakers have mentioned, and I will really refer to 2 key challenges. The first one is, of course, that of ensuring that all these investments are wrapped within networks. Networks meaning on 2 dimensions, right? There's the geographical dimension, hence the integration, but also the multimodal dimension. And you clearly see that when that notion is preserved, things do happen. We do have a number of cases, well, I don't want to keep mentioning, but I mentioned earlier the Tangier-Med experience and all the logistics which has been developed around it. That is certainly a very positive experience. And the other one is we need to bring in the private sector, and it's a real need. If you look at the indebtedness of these countries, not surprisingly, in the context of COVID, I think on average it's gone from 45 to 56, 57% of the GDP. So there is some sort of budgetary stress inevitably, and the fact of the pandemic is still out there. We're not over. And that brings me to the need of to do some proper planning. And proper planning to me means really assessing the externalities of projects. I refer to some challenges which need to be addressed altogether: social, environmental, digital. So externalities assessment is very, very important. In a way, I agree with what Claudio said. I think maybe that's also where MDBs can help. It's something that we do and we have to do for the sake of supporting sustainable infrastructure. When it comes to climate, you will not be surprised, like others, the EIB has made a very important decision, I think, and that is to only finance infrastructure which is Paris aligned as from January of this year. So it has been an important decision, which has also implied a number of important, which has had a number of implications in our energy lending policy, in our transport lending policy, notably, which are two of the main pillars of what we do. Then, of course, you have, and it was mentioned earlier, the importance to set the regulatory framework which is conducive to investments by the private sector. There's no way private sectors can at large scale invest if it feels it is exposed to risks that they cannot quantify, they cannot manage. So, and you see where that dimension is being looked after, investments are being done. We mention energy as being as an important one. Another, and I conclude with that, another important element to me is really the making sure that some of the resources are also brought to into these schemes through economic incentives. This is not as, we've seen that the relevance of this in all different circumstances, including in Europe. We've had the case of the Juncker plan, for those who are familiar with that, which I think was the first time which in large scale resources, which had been in the past used for grants, were transposed into financial instruments, incentives, to give the private sector the little bridge in terms of economic efficiency that would be conducive to and this is something again that I think it's embedded into a number of recent initiatives, notably from the Commission, when Global Gateway, for instance, or Indici. If you're familiar with that, you see the scale of financial instruments within this, overarching, initiatives. And there again, I think maybe that's something that EIB, like others, can contribute towards these promoters who become on the back of these very ambitious investment plans. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Claudio, your experience in the field and overseeing projects in the field, what have you learned about what are the lessons from private-public partnerships, how they can work better to enhance infrastructure connectivity, maybe what some of the hurdles that they face are?
Well, thank you very much. I would say, well, I think everybody understands that the PPP debate has been going on for many years, not necessarily with fantastic experiences across the board, so that they work more or better in certain sectors, certain segment like airport is very feasible, in the energy is feasible, in ports is feasible, in roads it becomes a little bit more difficult. But I would say if a PPP is done by a particular country to fundamentally alleviate two fundamental issues, the one is sovereign debt capacity. So you need to bring in private sector to finance a project that otherwise the government would not be able to finance. And efficiency, PPPs can be the right solution. One lesson out of our PPP experience is that, first of all, they can be an accelerator for infrastructure development. There was a case, actually, Sergio, you bring to my attention, this big solar panel farm that we had in southern Egypt, that accelerated the need for improvement in the grid system, because obviously if you produce green energy, then you need to transport green energy, and that actually was a accelerator of additional investment in infrastructure. So there is a connection between PPP and acceleration in infrastructure. The other point about PPPs is that if they are implemented in true partnership with the local business community at the small and big level, they also can be an accelerator of development locally. We see many times where PPP developed correctly, you have a boost of local economy transition, especially in suppliers of whatever materials and equipment and technology that are needed for PPP development. It depends on what the government actually has negotiated. And here I want to put on the table something which is not for this discussion, but it is probably for reflection, which is really very much the role of China, which has across the Mediterranean and beyond the regions, and the role of China, which is a little bit of an outlier, as all of us know, in particular because of the issue of governance of agreements with governments and PPPs, transparency in the way they're executed, and the fact that contracts are fully captive. Now, this is not something that we can ignore, and in fact, we are not ignoring, okay, but it is a reality in the region. If you look at certain situations, the extreme one is, for instance, the one of Montenegro, where the whole country could collapse because of existing obligation vis-a-vis China. That is actually something which has to be reflected. How can we, in fact, put forward a proposal to our counterparties in government, which is more compelling than what in a fairly untransparent way is actually proposed by China? This is a big elephant in the room. It's very difficult to talk about this one, but it is also very relevant. One of the way, in a way, one of the avenues for the solution for this one, or the possible solution, is actually look at what Lucas said before. You know, there's going to be a gigantic amount of resources made available by the European Union for integration. And it is essential that us as international institutions, European and non-European, actually work with these resources to bring in private sector. We've done, I think, collectively many good things. And if you look at what we do with the financial institution, for instance, we have used incentives to push commercial banks to go into segments where they otherwise would never have gone. Women in business, young entrepreneurship, mismatching of skills in the job market. We have pushed them through incentives. Now, can we do the same more with infrastructure, including PPP schemes? Obviously, yes. We can do much more. The resources are, in a way, looking at the resource issue, what Stefano was saying before, they are more than we can deploy. So it is better that we act together to create the incentives even for PPPs. Last point I want to make, which nothing to do with PPP per se, but there is a connection. It is about our ability as financial partners to work in a sort of stronger, cohesive, and coordinated way upstream. Okay, especially if you look at the southern part of the Mediterranean. We have many cases of cooperative projects where we co-finance or work together. We don't have many cases of policy dialogue with local authorities on infrastructure that we conduct together to have more leverage to push for reforms, which also would call for a much stronger coordination among ourselves. Again, World Bank, IFC, EIB, EBRD, everybody who's on the table, and private sector. So I would say, if there is a lesson also on PPP, is that they need to have a proper regulatory framework, and we need to go and press to governments collectively and together, so that the reforms actually can be accelerated. So we can do it. We have a leverage. We have the money. We have the ability to build financial instruments. The more we do it together, I think the more the impact, the stronger the impact we can have on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudio. Those are good closing thoughts in terms of food for thought, because I think our time is just about up, and rather than starting the cycle of questions again and leaving some people disadvantaged, maybe we will end this conversation here. But I think the thoughts that Claudio leaves us with are, of course, big elephants in the room, but terrific challenges to consider, and perhaps the restarting of economies post-COVID. And I know we're not through it by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a moment for a fresh start when projects do get going, when life really does feel like it's fully back on track. So perhaps this global gateway announced by the European Union will provide an impetus for the EU to be in there coordinating policy and creating other incentives to give an alternative to Belt and Road for countries who would choose another path, or it's just another option and an opportunity for the Mediterranean, of course, to be better linked up shore by shore. I want to thank you all for your time and sharing your wisdom, all of you in such a critical sector, and wishing you all the best and lots of energy and inspiration. And I hope that we can all meet again and take the discussion forward. Thank you and bon weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.